Hello, to wherever we find you in the world. My name is Nicole Cirillo, and I am the Executive Director of the International Association for Volunteer Effort. I offer a hearty welcome to this IAVE's first webinar of the year, in which we will explore the future trends in volunteering. IAVE is delivering this webinar in partnership with our dear friends Forum, the International Forum for Volunteering and Development, the United Nations Volunteer Program, and the Volunteer Groups Alliance. Exploring trends in volunteering is a topic worth exploration at any time. But now, as we hopefully begin to emerge from the COVID-19 crisis and start to make sense of our post-pandemic world, it is especially so. Next slide, please. When I talk to people about volunteering during COVID, I like to show this slide that demonstrates the heroic volunteer response in Eastern China in the early days of the pandemic. On January 20th, click please, the number of COVID-19 related volunteers in the region was just 9 among a total of over 12,000 volunteers. But by the time the infection peaked in February, click, more than 20,000 volunteers a day were involved in relief efforts there. The daily volunteering rate remained above 20,000 through February as the curve began to flatten. And this is certainly impressive, but remembering back to this time and the uncertainty about the level of risk this virus posed, and yet seeing these volunteers in China, and indeed all across the globe, still acted, deploying and redeploying to address the crisis. IAVE believes the COVID-19 pandemic has emphasized how volunteers, as agents of change, provide the practical action that builds hope and resilience and improves lives and strengthens communities. But seeing volunteers in this way takes understanding how they experienced one of the greatest challenges of our time. So in 2020, IAVE commissioned research about the strategic role of national volunteering leadership organizations and their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Data was collected from across 67 countries, and the research report, Leadership for Volunteering, the COVID-19 experience, was launched this past September. Shortly before IAVE commissioned our research, Forum commissioned their own, entitled COVID-19 and the Future of Volunteering for Development, which also launched in 2021. Alongside this, UNV published the next State of the World's Volunteerism Report 2022, Building Equal and Inclusive Societies. So it seemed like an important moment to bring these 3 pieces of global research together to share knowledge, highlights, and to consider the strategic common issues and trends they each surfaced in order to reflect on what evidence indicates for the future of volunteering. Equally, in preparation for IAVE's World Volunteer Conference in October of 2022, we will be engaging the global volunteering family in the new Universal Declaration of Volunteering. The first IAVE declaration, launched in 1990, was revised and reissued in 2001 to kick off the United Nations Year of the Volunteer. But IAVE feels it is timely to relaunch this declaration, one fit for the 21st century, one that encompasses recognition for the value and impact of volunteers, one that integrates formal and informal volunteering, and of course, one that promotes inclusion towards a more just and sustainable world. Our discussion today will officially launch the process to undertake this new Universal Declaration for Volunteering. So let's embark on this very important conversation. First, adding their own context We will hear briefly from our partners, Heather Schachter, Board Chair of Forum, and David Stiers, Coordinator for the Volunteer Groups Alliance. Following this, we will hear from the researchers themselves, each taking 10 minutes to share key findings of what these mean for the future of volunteering. Finally, we will hear from an academic IAVE commissioned to create a brief on the common issues and themes she saw emerging from these three reports. We will then have the opportunity to pose questions and engage in what I know will be a fruitful and interesting panel discussion. Some practical information: please use the question function at the bottom of your screen. Even if we don't get to your questions today, we will capture them and share them with the researchers and our partners to ensure that we're understanding the many thoughts and comments that you have. Also, all registrants will receive a link to this webinar. Also, we'll receive the paper that we are formulating the brief from, and of course, a link to the 3 pieces of research from IAVE, Forum, and of course, the UNV. So let me begin by asking Heather Schachter and David Stiers of the Forum and the VGA to share a few words in support of this webinar. Heather?
Thank you, Nicole, and welcome everyone. As the chair of Forum, the International Forum for Volunteering in Development, it's my pleasure to welcome everyone here today to today's webinar. As organizations that work with volunteers, I think we all sense that our sector is at a crossroads, that the world around us is changing, and we need to adapt so that we can thrive and make the greatest possible contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. COVID, climate, and the movement to decolonize aid and development present both challenges and opportunities in the coming years. So this is exactly the right time to come together and share research and insights on the future of volunteering. We're very well served by research on volunteering at this moment. I'm really looking forward to hearing about the important work from IAVE and the UN Volunteers Program, as well as our own work on COVID-19 and the future of volunteering for development. Helene and her colleagues did an exceptional job, and we're looking forward to hearing from her today. Finally, I want to acknowledge the fact that Forum, IAVE, UNV, and the Volunteer Groups Alliance are coming together today. We share a mission with these other networks, and there's a lot we can achieve by working even more closely together. And I hope that today's collaboration is just the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I can attest to that, and I can assure you it is just the beginning, much more fruitful initiatives in our partnership ahead. David, from the Volunteer Groups Alliance, may I ask you to come in?
Thank you so much, Heather, for those words and for your introduction, Nicole. As part of the major groups and other stakeholders coordinate the United Nations Volunteer Stakeholder Group, the Volunteer Groups Alliance, or VGA, is a global coalition of more than 70 organizations that contribute to sustainable development through volunteering. And the VGA works to gain recognition for the important role volunteers play at local, regional, and national levels and in UN processes. There can be no silver lining from the horrific impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had around the globe in terms of the tragic loss of millions of human lives, the hundreds of millions of illnesses, and the disruption of daily existence for all of us. But if there is a bronze lining, it is how volunteers, like in many times of trouble before, have rallied to help their communities face these challenges together and support those most in need. As stated in the UN Resolution 75/233, volunteering is a powerful and cross-cutting means of implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And a conducive environment for volunteering enhances our efforts to build back better from COVID-19 while advancing the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda. And when people are encouraged to get involved in solving problems, the solutions are more likely to be feasible and lasting. And by volunteering, people take action to improve not only the lives of those around them, but their lives as well. It is important now more than ever to integrate volunteers and the spirit of volunteering into national and global implementation strategies and to build an inclusive world. Volunteers not only help in times of immediate need, but raise awareness and champion change needed for tomorrow. And that's why I want to thank IAVE for organizing this webinar and why it's so important to look at this research from IAVE, Forum, and UNV. And we are so excited to share it with you today. And we at VGA are so grateful for this partnership to make us all stronger together.
Thank you so very much, David. Much appreciate your constant partnership and friendship. All right, I see lots of people joining the conversation, past board members, current friends and associates and colleagues. Welcome to all. And let's begin this discussion, shall we? We're going to start with Ben Lowe, who was responsible for leading IAVE's research, Leadership for Volunteering, the COVID-19 Experience. Ben is Associate Professor of the School of Social Work and the Director of the Geese College of Business at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He is a leading academic researcher and writer in the volunteering field and has a prolific research and publication record with key strengths in both qualitative and quantitative research. Welcome, Ben.
Hello, everyone. Looking to start my video here, but I can't seem to start it. There we go. All right, it's good to be with you this morning. Great to see so many faces in the chat from different parts of the country. I will be speaking today about Leadership for Volunteering, a study commissioned by IAVE. Next slide, please. This study was commissioned to understand the role of volunteering leadership organizations and specifically to understand how IAVE and other organizations like IAVE can support volunteering in the time of COVID and other crises. Next slide. This research was led by Dr. Jacob Mwatimati from Kenya and now in South Africa. And these are the other members of the research team. I'll be moving through these slides very quickly, so won't be pausing to talk very extensively on any of these slides. So I would encourage you to get the report and download it. Next slide, please. So the primary research question that we asked in this research was, how have VLOs, which are volunteering leadership organizations across the world, responded to the pandemic? And that was the overarching question that we'll be addressing today. Next slide. The research methodology that we used for this study was to survey and to talk to volunteer leadership organizations. The online survey was sent to 125, 70 responded from many countries, 67 countries, mostly from Europe and Asia Pacific, a few less from other areas of the world, but we got a good representation from across the world, and then also had conversations with 31 representatives of these organizations, many of them governmental, also NGOs and nonprofits, and then some which are from a larger coalition or network. Next slide. The first thing that we found was that there was a growth of partnerships and coalitions across the volunteering organization world, from private sector to governments to NGOs and nonprofits. The reason for these partnerships was, one, for advocacy, but also to increase the resource base as resources shifted during the pandemic. Many of the NGOs increased their partnership with governments or companies, and this led to some really productive and useful partnerships going forward. Next slide. Some of the advocacy that these different partnerships led to was to increase momentum for volunteers' work that was started during the pandemic. So when any kind of crisis starts, sometimes people are scrambling to find answers, and volunteers in this situation were a very important answer to many of the problems that came out during COVID. So VLOs became the go-to organizations that a lot of governments and others would look to, and were able to inform these different problems, specifically around how volunteers can engage with the issues. So COVID in some ways became a catalyst for advocacy for volunteering policies. It helped to create a stronger enabling environment for volunteering. And some of the volunteers and NGOs that use volunteers participated in vaccination campaigns and other direct programs as a response to COVID. Next slide. Another advocacy issue that was of pretty strong importance during the pandemic was around inclusiveness. Exclusion was a barrier to participation for a lot of people, and that became obvious, especially for those that were most vulnerable to COVID. So there was a lot of advocacy around including women and girls, some around including refugees, around language issues, around financial barriers that prevented people from participating. And so a lot of the work was around inclusion from a domestic standpoint, but also inequalities in the treatment of volunteers, from local and formal volunteers to international external volunteers. So a lot of the advocacy was around increasing inclusiveness for laws that discriminated against volunteers or that didn't provide enough policies to include them and to enable an environment for everyone to volunteer. Next slide. Another area besides advocacy was capacity development, developing capacity for volunteer involving organizations to mobilize volunteers and to capacitate volunteers themselves. So a lot of the priorities that VLOs engaged in was volunteer safety and safeguarding policies, improving quality standards so that VIOs from local levels were able to implement the policies that were built around effective practices and strong research about what makes for good volunteering during crises. And then a lot of the capacity was to support community-based and informal volunteering. Instead of looking kind of at a larger national level, recognizing that some of the best work was done by community volunteers, by informal volunteers, especially given the challenges that a lot of the NGOs were experiencing at the time. But COVID also had a complex impact on volunteer involving organizations. Many of the organizations that VLOs worked with had to close their doors, either temporarily or permanently. And so in this way, capacity building was negatively affected. On the other hand, COVID also created new opportunities for capacity building, specifically around the way that VIOs, volunteer involving organizations, use technology, use social media, and also use, again, local volunteers. Next slide. Another way that VLOs really helped to capacitate local volunteer organizations was around mobilization. So mobilizing volunteers to engage despite all the other challenges that were happening with the pandemic. While 55% said that interest in volunteering generally increased in response to the challenges of COVID, an equal amount reported that they had less access to volunteers because of lockdown. So even though there was greater interest and supply was higher in some ways, the demand was also a challenge. So VLOs became directly involved in mobilizing volunteers at a larger level, but they also capacitated community-based organizations to mobilize volunteers themselves, again, through technology, social media, but also through coalitions, so they could join these larger coalitions to mobilize volunteers. Next slide. One of the things that we will talk about, I think, throughout this conversation today is about online volunteering and how that has changed in response to COVID. It has been seen as more accessible to volunteers with physical limitations, not only those who have disabilities, but also those who were temporarily limited because of COVID and the shutdowns. But they also found that although there were a lot of advantages from online and digital volunteering, this also increased exclusion for people who didn't have access to the internet or had poor access to the internet. Another way that volunteer mobilization strategies changed, besides community-based, was that young people were capacitated and involved more often because they were seen as less at risk. There was more efforts to involve young people, even when older adults would have traditionally taken those spots. Next slide. At a strategic level, inclusion was a really important aspect of what a lot of boards focused on. changing systems to be more inclusive, making sure that barriers to participation were broken down. And we saw a lot more focus on human rights, respect, and including those who were traditionally left out of the equation. Next slide. So what we found was one of the hallmarks of VLO leadership at this time was really innovating in response to challenges, preparing for future crises, recognizing that these things come at us quickly, and being prepared for future crises that were going to come up. One of the questions that came up was, will technology replace face-to-face volunteering? But the options aren't necessarily binary. There was lots of hybrid opportunities here, training, facilitating, mobilizing volunteers using technology, but then having maybe more presence for local volunteers to engage face-to-face, and for community-based organizations to capacitate and mobilize volunteers. Next slide. Around partnerships and resourcing, there was a reduction of funding as funding had to shift towards other areas of the pandemic. And so there were some questions around earned income and whether the social enterprise model would be a productive area for the future. Some disagreed, some agreed with this, but generally thinking about how do I diversify funding sources so that VLOs can work with volunteers and support volunteers in different ways. Next slide. Overall, there was an increase in networking and coalition building across all levels during COVID, from, again, the very local level to more regional, national levels, and even at the international level around international coalitions and networks. But generally, consistent with the mission of IAVE's GNVL, VLOs said that they were able to connect with, learn from, and share knowledge with other VLOs during this time, and that network was an important part of the experience of COVID. Next slide. So just to kind of wrap it up, VLOs and the future of volunteering, there was lots of focus around inclusion, localization, digitization, and partnerships. There were some really great intersections between these, for example, with localization, digitization, and capacitating these local organizations for inclusion and partnership, really understanding how these different partnerships can help advocate for volunteering. And these are main themes that you will read in the report. Next slide. Thank you for your time. I look forward to hearing more about the important topics of inclusion, digitization, localization, and networking throughout this presentation today.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much. Just a couple of quick questions. Yes, the PowerPoint presentation and the recording will be sent to all registrants. Someone asked, Jeff asked about what is a VLO? Great question. Volunteer Leadership Organization. And what differentiates it is that it is usually the organization in its country or region that looks after those local community volunteer involving organizations and makes sure it's building the capacity of those organizations to engage more people, to mobilize with greater effect. So they're the leadership organizations for volunteering in their country or their region. Ben, stick around because I have a question for you. Ben, unfortunately, has to leave us a bit early to do what teachers do and teach a class. So I do want to ask this question. We're getting already a lot of questions about what's going to happen next, right? As we come out of COVID-19, we've seen a lot of innovation, whether it's the digital, shifting to digital or informal volunteering. There's been a lot that has changed, some good, perhaps maybe some not good trends emerging. So I'd like to ask you, what is your top trend that you've observed that you'd like to see stay as we go back into a post-pandemic world? And Ben, if there's also a trend that you've seen emerging that you feel might pose some risk to the volunteer impact, we'd like to know that too. Ben, if you could quickly provide your insight on that.
Super, I will make it quick. I do think there's probably two trends, and I think mentioned them already, localization and digitization. These both have enormous potential. From the digitization side, certainly getting more people involved and inclusive, whether that's through micro-volunteering whether that's through online volunteering, that's a longer time frame. I think that's some things we've learned during the pandemic that will stick around and hopefully will stick around. There are challenges to that as well, certainly, Nicole, around exclusion. If they don't have access to the internet or don't have good access to the internet, then that can be a serious barrier as well. Can be a barrier also for young people, specifically for young girls who are sometimes the most excluded from having internet access. I will say also localization. I'm a big believer in the power of local communities and local volunteers, people engaging with others to help others in their community. And so I think what we've seen is a move from formal volunteering to more of this direct person-to-person engagement, and recognizing at the VLO level that we need to support that direct engagement, that person-to-person informal engagement, and less attention always to the formal volunteering that happens within organizations. So those are two trends that I hope will stick around. They're certainly not perfect, but I think we've seen a lot of value come out of these from the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Ben. I do have a feeling we're going to be talking about the digital divide later on in our conversation, and ensuring that as we increasingly become this virtual world, we're always making a place for people who are not able to participate at that level. Thank you for bringing that into the discussion. And Ben, you are such a resource to the volunteering sector globally, and I'm so glad that you were able to participate in this conversation.
Thank you, Nicole.
So I'm going to turn now to Helene Parole to present Forum's research entitled COVID-19 and the Future of Volunteering for Development. Helene is the director of Helene Parole and Associates, based in Johannesburg, South Africa. She has developed extensive research and evaluation experience in South Africa, as well as many areas around the globe. She was the founder and executive director of Vocesa, a nonprofit research organization that worked to build an evidence base in the field of volunteering and civil service in South Africa. Helene?
Okay, can you guys hear me?
We can certainly hear you. We cannot see you, but we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I think Jessica needs to start my video because I can't. Ah, there we go. Okay. Thank you, everybody. A real pleasure to be here, and wonderful to have the opportunity to present our research. Just a small point before I start. I'm sitting in my study in Johannesburg. It's late afternoon and the birds are planning to go to bed. So some of them are honking. If you're hearing them, please bear with us. Next slide, please, Jessica. Right, we conducted this research in 2020. It was commissioned by COVID to look at what alternative volunteering models were evolving in the course of the pandemic. That was obviously the first year. What lessons could be learned and what was said about the future direction of volunteering for development. What I'm highlighting here in this presentation are very briefly 3 key themes. There are many more, and we encourage you to read the reports that are on the Forum website. Firstly, we looked at organizational adaptive capability. How did they adapt? What did they do? How well or not? We looked at inequality in responses to COVID. That emerged as a strong theme, as Ben said. And finally, the opportunities and risks for volunteering for development. Next slide, please. Very quickly about our methodology. It was a mixed methods approach. Qualitative interviews and focus groups, all conducted virtually around the world through 8 countries, and they are mentioned there. We ran 2 surveys, a volunteer survey, to which we had 239 responses, a 30% response rate, and a survey of IFCOs and other volunteer involving organizations, the IFCOs being the international ones. And we had 39 of those organizations responding, also a 30% response rate, which we were very happy about. So you can see the spread of the information that we collected. And we did that working very closely with 7 international volunteer cooperation organizations. The Australian the Australian Volunteers Initiative, the CUSO International in Canada, France Volunteer, JICO in Japan, NOREC in Norway, UNITE based in Switzerland, and Volunteer Service Overseas. Thank you. Next slide. So looking at our 2 overarching findings, international volunteering did not stop because of COVID-19. And secondly, community and national volunteers were central to sustained and responsive program operations. And I think it's very important to note here that Forum's membership is largely made up of international sending organizations, which is why our lens in this case was largely on international sending programs. And that makes the second finding all the more important. So turning to the adaptive capability of the organizations we looked at, and just to again make a distinction, the study that Ben was talking about that we conducted for IAVE was looking at the volunteer leadership organizations. And as Nicole just pointed out, they support other networks of volunteer involving organizations in those countries. So it was in-country volunteering. Whereas in this study, we were looking at international volunteering as well as what was happening on the ground. So by adaptive capability, we mean how organizations adapt in the context of a crisis, how they reinvent their work in response to the sudden and disruptive impact of that crisis, such as a pandemic or in fact climate change. Next slide, please, Jessica. So looking very quickly at some of the data from our study, in this slide, you can see that in the face of the shutdowns, the face-to-face shutdowns, the operational adaptations were firstly, and one example is obviously the use of digital technology used to run operations, raise funds, do advocacy. But in each of these cases, there's a complexity. So for example, in one country, the organization was really challenged in terms of continuing the governance of its work because it spread through regions and not everybody had access to the technology, not everybody had the skills. So governance at a distance became very difficult. And in some cases, IPCO's introduced flexible funding processes to redirect resources to the new and emerging priorities. But many of the volunteer involving organizations were working 24/7 with skeleton staff. And in a crisis situation, it's very difficult to think creatively about new proposals. Some did, but many just were too busy and didn't have the space to do so. And that might have impacted later on proposals for future funding. And then just lastly, in the operations category, partner organizations had to restructure their activities. As the lockdowns changed and phased and the restrictions changed. But the problem with that was that the costs increased because you had to acquire the resources for digital capacity. And secondly, you had to start repeating activities for many more and smaller groups. So you had to travel more, you had to run more sessions, and all of that increased the costs. Next slide, please, Jessica, which starts looking at how the programs adapted to face-to-face shutdowns. And there we have examples, for example, where in the context of the pandemic, gender-based violence was escalating, as you all know. And in one case, it prompted the organization to use cell phones to extend its counseling services to women extremely successfully. Not only in the region the city where they were working, which was Lima, but throughout the provinces of Peru and even into Brazil. The complexity there was around gender-based violence training. Some indigenous communities closed their doors to outside volunteers, not only international volunteers, but other volunteers coming and living in urban areas because they were worried about getting infected. And as you know, in many countries, the infection rates increased much more quickly in urban areas than elsewhere. And so that stopped a program which was working extremely well for women in those communities, despite the availability of technology and the efforts to combat gender-based violence. In another country, one of the IFCOs turned to using old media to continue and support their education program activities, in this case, print media and radio. But interestingly, they had to depend on the community volunteers to distribute those radios and to monitor the implementation. And it was largely to conduct their sign language program and also other education programs, because what normally happened in school was no longer possible because schools had closed. And so it was all home-based and depended enormously on the community volunteers. And then just a small example, finally, in one country, a climate change advocacy group had to reinvent their strategies completely. And to do so, they tried to use digital technology, but it really was foreign terrain for them, especially in the advocacy context. They did partner with a group who enabled them to do that. But nevertheless, they found that the online contact that they were using to mobilize and to cement their relationships with young people in particular was insufficient, because they felt that they really needed spaces in which they could share experiences together, meet physically, and that the online contact that they were dealing with at that point was not enough. And it's probably changed by now, but at the point that we were doing our research, that was what was found. Next slide, please, Jessica. So as Ben mentioned in the other study, in this study which preceded that one, the inequalities also became more visible. Like in the IAVE study, the application of the duty of care and safeguarding was, became very complicated and demonstrated inequalities in that repatriation and the safety in that strategy depended basically on what passport you were carrying and what program you were involved in. So, for example, there were youth programs that were shut down by the UK government. The other state organizations contracted to do the international volunteering, like NORIC, ABI, and others, QSO, had to repatriate their volunteers, and there was very little consultation with the volunteers about that, but others remained. And so in the case of non-governmental IFCOs, there was more autonomy, and some actually left arrangements to the partner organizations and the volunteer. So returning to our very first observation that international volunteering did not stop. It didn't, because there were people who remained in place or people who came back. And in the case of the UNITE organizations, there was some interesting information there. But the question remains, why should some volunteers have a higher level of duty of care than others? And what are the safeguarding principles and how are they applied equitably? And very quickly, some of those international organizations and volunteer involving organizations found that their protocols were not effective. Those who'd had prior experience of disasters and volunteers in caught in disasters tended to be more effective, but 40% of those IFCO's respondents said that they were reviewing their protocols. Financial support changed. One IFCO was said to have stopped paying stipends to their community volunteers. Another IFCO was very concerned that reciprocity may be compromised through online volunteering. We can talk more about that. And then, as Ben mentioned, the digital divide is a persistent factor. It was then and it still is in undermining the use of technology strategies. So next slide, please, Jessica. Turning then to the future opportunities for volunteering for development, I think directionality is a very interesting area to watch, because we found that South-South programs had much far greater resilience than North-South or South-North. And in addition, in-country programs, and I think the IAVE study bears this out as well, those will all impact on the length, nature, and objectives of international volunteer interventions. Then the second major finding that I mentioned in the beginning, the resilience and essential role of national community volunteers. If they were to be, if that focus were to attract greater resourcing, the opportunities are greater scale with the same amount of money, because you're not spending money on travel and very expensive stipends and support and all that. There's a reduced risk to donors of programs closing suddenly, because the volunteers are in place and won't go anywhere. And one can look to more blended placements, a wider range of assignments. And there's some very interesting programs that have been put in place over the last few years. Potential areas of growth became clear, because with new partnerships, there was new opportunities to raise local revenue and not only international donors funding. And then finally, we concluded, one of our conclusions was that, you know, the North-South trajectory is really being challenged. And in my view, from a Southern perspective, you know, that's an important development. And what we said was, look, instead of continually looking at North-South or South-North, the Global North needs to start looking at regional volunteering to a greater extent, especially given the refugee crises, which are bringing very, very different communities into those countries. And there's a lot to be learned from those engagements. So North-North needs to start changing. And then finally, future risks. Jessica, the last slide. Volunteers in the international domain are an instrument of soft power. They are premised on sending nationals from one country to another. And if one were to go the route of using volunteers from within the partner country, that might actually compromise support, especially from governments who are investing in volunteering as an instrument of soft power. And then lastly, looking at the other way, northern countries sending volunteers to southern countries are often, you know, the return is likely to be that they need to contribute to a changing consciousness of their fellow citizens in their home countries. If they don't go, that can't happen. And so the one mission of the sending organization will be compromised, as will the donor objective. Thank you. That's all I've got time for, and I look forward to more questions. Our reports are available, and I encourage you to read them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helene, and thank you for surfacing those inequalities and for reminding us of who is often left behind in certain circumstances. It'll be really good to unpack that a little bit later and to understand some of the decision-making around that. But now let me turn to the United Nations Volunteers Program and to Jane Matumbi, who is policy specialist for the United Nations Volunteers Program and was involved in coordinating and managing the research for the 2022 State of the World's Volunteerism Report. Jane holds a PhD in political science and has interests in socioeconomic policy and research. And we are very much interested in hearing from Jane and from her perspectives of the World Volunteerism Report from UNV 2022, Building Equal and Inclusive Societies. Jane?
Thank you, Nicole, for that introduction and for the opportunity to present our research. I'll present on the UNV's, the United Nations Volunteers Program latest report, flagship report, and it's on building equal and inclusive societies. It's the state of the world's volunteerism report for 2020. Next slide, please, Jessica. So in terms of the report, we refer to it as the SWVR in short. The State of the World's Volunteerism Report is a flagship report of the UNV. It's published every 3 years, and its role basically is to inform as well as advocate on the role of volunteerism for peace and development. So the 2022 report is the fourth in this series, the first one having been published in 2011, followed by another edition in 2015, and another one in 2018. For the 2022 report, basically it presents new evidence on the role of volunteerism as a means of solving global and local development challenges, as well as how that can contribute towards the achievement of the Agenda 2030 on sustainable development. So as you will see, when we get into the discussion parts of the report, this report basically focused on research that was conducted in countries in the global south. Next slide, please, Jessica. So in terms of the research questions that informed this report, they looked at what the state of world's volunteerism is in 2020, how volunteer state partnerships can help effectively address 21st century development challenges, how volunteer state partnerships can contribute to building equal and inclusive societies, as well as which policies can enable volunteering to contribute to building equal and inclusive societies. Next slide, please. So this report came up at an interesting time where there was this global discussion going on the social contract and how development needs to address some of the most pressing challenges and inequality, as well as inclusiveness being two issues, that inequality and exclusion being challenges, and how then we, the development, as well as other stakeholders, can engage in development that leads to more equitable and is inclusive. So that helped inform this report. And one of the ways this report helped to address that is to look at models, and used volunteer state partnerships as models. And they're an important mechanism for expanding volunteer roles and for achieving the sustainable development goals. And as we'll see as we go on with the discussion, engaging volunteers from marginalized communities in partnership with their governments can play a role in helping to lay the foundation for creating a social contract that is founded on inclusion and in inequality, and leads to more responsive outcomes for local communities. Next slide, please. So we'll get into the 2022 research. Next slide, Jessica. As far as the report is concerned, it has two parts. There's the quantitative studies that were undertaken for this report. And basically they look at the global estimates. That's a chapter on its own. And there's also a chapter on a study that was undertaken by the UNV in partnership with the Gallup organization. And that is based on volunteering during COVID in 8 countries in the global south. The other part of it are qualitative studies, and this was case studies research that was undertaken in various countries in the global south. And for this research, the University of East Anglia in the UK was involved in undertaking the case studies along with other research partners, researchers and universities around the world. So the qualitative studies, they were based in Asia and the Pacific, in Nepal, Fiji, and China, in Latin America and the Caribbean, in Arab states, specifically Tunisia and Lebanon, in African countries, as well as in Europe and the Commonwealth of Independent States. Next slide, please. So on the quantitative chapters, on the global volunteers estimates chapter, the new evidence on volunteers shows that globally, an estimated 862 million people, these are considered working age group between 15 and older, perform at least one form of volunteering activity every month. The other element in terms of the findings of this research was on gender disparities in volunteering between men and women, and they persist. And one of the differences here that we see in terms of the disparities, men tend to be, number one, more engaged in formal volunteering, and women in informal volunteering. And women tend to receive less support, and also there's less recognition of informal volunteering. Women also face significant challenges that limit their participation in volunteering in general. And despite the disparities, volunteering offers diverse pathways to participation. So you find volunteers engage in different ways, whether it's through civic participation or in other ways. Two key emerging trends from the global volunteers estimates was 6.5% of working age people engage in formal volunteering through an organization or an association, and 14.3% of working age persons engage in informal volunteering. So that is the more dominant form of volunteering. And in terms of informal volunteering, it tends to occur basically between individuals and within local communities. Next slide, please. As far as the study that was undertaken by UNV and Gallup, this was done within the context of COVID. It was undertaken in March of 2021. The study was undertaken in 8 countries in the global south, in Bolivia, India, Kenya, Lebanon, Senegal, Thailand, Turkey, and Uzbekistan. And this study looked at trends during COVID, as well as before, during, as well as projections on what the future of volunteering in these countries will be. So in terms of the trends, we saw that informal volunteering was dominant, but the share of formal volunteering was also significant. And again, going back to the definition used in the previous slide, informal volunteering tended to occur between individuals and within communities, and formal was basically through an organization or through a government program. And like explained a little bit earlier, there were also gender disparities in volunteering. And in this case, more men volunteered when compared to women. And it is only within the context of the 8 countries. Next slide, please. As far as some of the findings of volunteering, we looked at volunteering in terms of the types, and we found that there was an interest in volunteering to develop new ideas, or what we call social innovation, for the purpose of addressing local issues. And this increased in most countries, while volunteering through civic participation, which is probably one of the ways that we are more familiar with as far as how volunteers engage in civic activities, declined and this was during COVID. Other trends as far as the future of volunteering are concerned, when the volunteers were polled, they indicated that they intended to engage in diverse roles beyond informal volunteering and service provision, and that they also intended to work with others to identify innovative solutions to local problems, as well as in civic engagement. So definitely, like some of the other speakers have indicated, despite the pandemic, there was still the interest in volunteering did not wane, and it is quite promising that there's an interest even in continuing to volunteer beyond the pandemic. Next slide, please. So we're going to discuss the second aspect, or the second part of the report, which focuses on the three models on volunteer state partnerships. Next slide, please. So one has to do with volunteer state partnerships in decision making. And in this one, volunteers partner with their governments in decision making to help address specific challenges within their communities. For this one, the case studies were undertaken in Nepal, Ecuador, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Tunisia. And as indicated when we started off, the partnerships were between volunteers from marginalized groups with their governments, and the groups that were engaged were from indigenous communities in Nepal, for instance, farmers in DRC, and Tunisia, rural women in Kyrgyzstan, and activists in Ecuador. And in terms of the roles, for instance, in the decision-making, volunteers engaged in providing advice or information and engaging in decision, in deliberations with their governments in specific areas. Next slide, please. There were also volunteer state partnerships in co-production, and here volunteers worked with their governments to basically deliver services or develop the services. And the case studies that were undertaken were in Lebanon, in China, in Senegal, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. And the volunteers partnered with their governments on issues related to migration, disability rights, employment, reproductive health, and gender. And what was interesting here is a lot of the volunteers came from these specific communities, so they had a really good grasp on the issues, and that helped the partnerships. Next slide, please. I can see we are running out of time. So the third model, and which is the final model that we looked at in the report, is on volunteer state partnerships on social innovation. And basically here, volunteers partnered with their governments to develop new ideas that would then address issues at the local level. And the research that was undertaken here was case study research again in Malawi, Kenya, Trinidad and Tobago, as well as some of the islands in the Caribbean and Fiji and the Pacific Islands. The partners came from, again, marginalized groups, and these were basically youth, urban poor in Kenya, women market vendors in the Pacific, as well as, and they looked at also issues on sexual and reproductive health, as well as rural health in Colombia. Next slide, please. As far as the key findings of the report, in terms of volunteer state partnerships, the report found that volunteers serve as bridge builders, basically by helping broker relationships between communities and state authorities, as well as other development partners that they work with. Volunteerism also enables people to shape and own their own development. Volunteering also helps offer diverse pathways to civic participation. There are different ways of engaging, but gaps still remain with respect to volunteer practices and aspirations across countries and regions. And here I'd mention an issue like still that gender disparities being a major issue across countries and regions. And the final key finding was by partnering with governments, volunteers ensure more responsive outcomes to communities' needs, and which helps build a culture of participatory governance. Next slide, please. As far as the recommendations to policymakers, this report, is asking policymakers, basically, one of the issues, one of the recommendations is to address barriers that are faced by marginalized groups in order to promote volunteerism. Also, addressing gender-related volunteering disparities and inequalities is key to ensuring that more women, for example, get to participate and are involved. Leveraging volunteers' expertise, knowledge, and experiences for development will be crucial going forward. Recognition of informal volunteers' work and their contributions is critical. Informal volunteers tend to get very little recognition. And one of the areas that needs attention of policymakers, as well as other stakeholders, is investment in volunteer data, research and measurement, which continues to be a huge issue. There's very limited data out there. And so finding ways to enhance that and increase the data that is there would be helpful. Next slide, please. Basically, that's a snapshot of the 2022 report. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with us, and the report is available online as well. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Jane. And I know that many of us look forward to this report and diving into this report because it is so very foundational to the work we do. So thank you for all that you've done and all of the wisdom and thinking that went into this. And we must have you back for an hour and a half just talking about this report. But now I'm going to turn it over to Alice Chadwick-Elali. You'll remember I said at the beginning that IAVE commissioned an academic to look at all three of these incredibly important pieces and to find out what she saw as the trends and the themes coming out of these. So I'm very much excited to present Alice. Alice recently completed her doctorate at the University of Bath. Her research explored the role of volunteering within development projects in Sierra Leone and how this interacts with employment and citizenship. She is interested in volunteering as a response to crisis and the connection between volunteering and development and the role of volunteering within the SDGs. So I hand it over to you, Alice, to tell us what you saw as the trends and themes emerging in all three of these excellent pieces of work.
Thanks, Nicole, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Great to see so many people from around the world. So as Nicole said, I was looking at synergies across the three pieces of research that have just been presented, and I'll now outline my findings of this synthesis. Next slide, please. So I've grouped my analysis into three areas. I think there's commonalities in terms of the context in which volunteering has taken place. And then I identify 6 key trends, which are both modalities of volunteering and mechanisms to support volunteering. Next slide, please. So in terms of the context, I've characterized the current context as a constellation of crises. So as we know, two of these reports were commissioned because of COVID-19. So that hasn't been an overarching crisis that's shaping and reshaping the volunteering space. But alongside this, the climate crisis is mentioned by all three pieces of research as an area that volunteers both need to address in terms of both programming and also advocacy efforts. And interacting with this, we have the issue of increasing inequalities, which has led to the State of the World Volunteerism report to position volunteering as a means of building forward better through the inclusion of marginalized groups. So we can see these other two crises as interacting and producing increased inequalities between countries, which volunteering can be positioned to both address, but also needs to be aware of the risks involved in reproducing them further, as identified within the IAVE and Forum reports. So I'll now move to the 6 trends I've identified. So the first trend is broader recognition of who volunteers are. So this is connected to the localization theme from the IAVE report, the focus on national and community volunteering within Forum, and the State of the World Volunteerism report focus on bringing recognition to informal volunteering roles. So this is not necessarily looking at new volunteering structures, but broadening understanding by organizations of the variety of activities and structures that exist within volunteering space. So COVID-19 has highlighted across North and South how people volunteering within their own communities are vital for addressing challenges in an inclusive and relevant way. And this has brought broader recognition to informal and community-led volunteering efforts. And the policy pointer we have around that concerns providing extra support and recognition for such models. I now move to the second trend. So inclusion is a common organizing framework across all 3 pieces of research for understanding both who volunteers and how, but also what volunteering can do and how to address the inequalities I outlined at the beginning. So IAVE highlights the role of volunteer leadership organizations in supporting the inclusion of marginalized groups, and Forum, as we saw, identified those challenges and the inequalities between treatment of different types of volunteers within their research. So the policy pointer here concerns addressing barriers to volunteering faced by marginalized groups to ensure that volunteering can be more inclusive and thereby deliver more inclusive services and programs to the people they're trying to support. Next slide, please. The third trend around modalities of volunteering concerns technology, which I'm sure is no surprise to everyone here. So the spread of technology alongside the challenges of COVID-19 has accelerated online and technology-enabled volunteering models and diversified ways in which volunteers can come together and contribute. So we've seen the shift to online models for international volunteering, and also the role of technology in bringing people together to advocate or promote volunteering, as we're all doing today. But I think the longer term, we're seeing a shift to blended approaches, with online volunteering not as a distinct category, but perhaps offering a more of a continuum between online and face-to-face, with individual volunteers, organizations and programs using different approaches at different times. And as identified strongly by the research, there are still so many inequalities in access and infrastructure. And this is picked up in the policy pointer around this trend. Next slide, please. So I now move more towards mechanisms for recognizing and supporting volunteering. So trend 4 concerns government engagement volunteering. This is a theme across the reports, but obviously is especially within the State of the World Volunteerism report, which has state partnerships and the social contract as its overarching framework. So this concerns both working with governments in co-producing services and advocating for an enabling environment for volunteering through developing legislation, but it also concerns working with governments to co-produce services and work towards development. And this is captured, both the advocacy role and the program role is captured within the policy pointer around this trend. And then next slide, please. The 5th trend concerns partnerships and collaboration. So beyond working with states, COVID-19 has also been a catalyst for new partnerships and collaborations with civil society and the private sector. So reduced resources due to funding challenges, economic constraints, and also increasing needs have required greater collaboration to mobilize resources and create a broader coalition for change. And the policy pointer for this trend recognizes that these coalitions and collaborations are not just within countries, but can be transnational, global, as well as regional. Next slide, please. So the final trend identified across the reports and the final mechanism, I think really speaks to what we're doing here today, which is coalitions for shared action and learning. So there is a consensus across the reports and within their future direction and identified recommendations that consortiums, coalitions, and networks are a key feature of the changing volunteering landscape. This includes leveraging pre-existing networks, such as informal volunteering mechanisms, as well as forming new coalitions for shared action. And crucially, this approach involves both cooperation in delivering volunteering, as well as advocating and making a case for the role of volunteering in creating more inclusive societies. And this is recognized within the policy pointer for this slide. So that was a brief run through, sorry, next slide, please. That was a brief run through of the 6 trends I identified. This will be being produced as a short briefing paper, which should be available soon to everyone who's taken part in this webinar. I want to thank IAVE and all of the other partners for my involvement, and look forward to the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. And just to say that all of us are seeing Alice's findings for the first time. So we will be absolutely sure to take away her work and to really allow it as a roadmap for us to dive deeper into all 3 pieces of this research. So thank you. I'm seeing lots of comments in the chat. Awesome, great for all 3 of these, for excuse me, all 4 of the research pieces. And I really want to echo that. Let's get right to the questions. We are hearing in the chat and in the questions, and indeed in each one of your presentations, this word inclusivity and equity coming up. People are talking about gender equity. They're talking about equity between North-South. They're talking about racial equity, and of course, the equity in wealth and disparities across all of these. So I'm going to ask you each to give your perspective on this. Much of the pieces of the research, and indeed in our own lives, we're looking at issues of equity and inclusion, and we're asking ourselves, how can we do better than what we've done before? So I'm going to ask each of you that question. What global trends are you seeing that are really supporting this notion of inclusivity? And what trends might you be seeing that are worrisome in this regard? So again, each of you to take time to comment about this issue of inclusion and about the global trends in volunteering you're seeing that support greater inclusion, be it gender, be it race, be it wealth, be it North-South. And what are some things that you're actually worried might actually have a negative impact? So I'm going to begin in the reverse order that we started. And I'm going to actually begin with you, Alice, because you have had the privilege of looking across this. And then I'm going to ask Jane and then Helene to give their responses to this. Alice?
I think in terms of the trend, it's an increasing recognition of what already exists within communities, and that being a more inclusive approach as opposed to having organizations or governments having a pre-existing idea of what volunteering is and what type of volunteering is needed to address challenges within a certain community or society. So I'm remembering within the State of the World Volunteerism report, the focus on thinking of volunteers as partners in delivering services, as opposed to being sort of, some kind of instrumental role in delivering something that someone else defines. So I think that's part of the inclusion question. And then in terms of risks, I think as with many of these things, it's the gap between rhetoric and action. In terms of thinking about, we can look at the policy reports and see all these commitments to more inclusive approaches, but how does that actually happen, and how are people being included, and how do people feel about that? I think there was some good points made from the forum report about how, from what I remember, about how the shift online had, in some instances, sort of amplified an existing sort of knowledge hierarchy. Especially if you had someone from the global north volunteering online to support someone in the global south, it created this, it amplified an existing divide and made it seem that that person was coming and bringing some form of expert knowledge. So I think that's the kind of risks that we need to think about, how maybe, and that's linked to the issues of infrastructure that all the reports have outlined, but be aware of the existing inequalities and how this sits within it. Thank you.
Jane?
Thank you. In terms of inequality, as mentioned, I think from the global perspective, there was this discussion on the new social contract and it being because of the ongoing inequalities and exclusion and being aggravated by the pandemic, that has had a major impact on development. And so how do we then, as part of building back better, think about ways of addressing inequality and ensuring that as we build back better, there's greater inclusion and equality. So from that point of view, when you look at the report, one of the ways that it tries to address that issue is working with volunteers from marginalized groups as a way and as key partners in development. They partner with their governments, and the outcomes that we are seeing is as a result of the partnerships between volunteers from marginalized groups and their governments, they're able to address issues within their communities and they're more responsive. So that's really a positive outcome, I'd say. In terms of the risks, we were now looking at new models, and I'd probably even just go back a little bit and say that looking at these three new models, three models, volunteer state partnerships in decision-making, in social innovation, and in co-production of services, that it's looking at new ways of working. How do we work in a new way? So there's always been that hierarchy, and this new model or new way of working then helps shift the power dynamics a little bit and promotes more equal partnerships between people and states in a way that is not or has not always been the case. Just in terms of the risks, probably just from my own perspective, I'd say maybe losing the momentum and going back to old ways of doing things. I think I'll stop there for now, because that is probably the only risk I can think of at the moment.
Thank you, Jane. Yes, change is indeed hard, and sticking with commitments and new frameworks is indeed hard. So I share your concern that it's often easier to revert back to what we used to do rather than honor the commitments to move forward. I am very optimistic that we'll be able to do that, though. Helene, may I ask your contribution to this very important question? What are the trends that you've seen surface that really are value add and promotional of inclusivity? And what are some of the risks that you've seen that might dampen our impact in that regard?
Thank you, Nicole. I'm emboldened by your positive outlook, but for me, I need to start with the risk, one of the risks. And these lie not so much in the volunteering sphere, but they lie in the global context. I think we're seeing greater and greater trends towards shutting down the civic space for action. And even within the COVID context, I need only refer to something that pains me greatly, which is that when South Africa announced the discovery of Omicron, our researchers were disparaged, and we were put on red lists, and we were unable to travel, and basically those actions killed our economic revival over our summer holidays. When we're now looking at the emergence of a new variant, I'm not seeing any European country on a red list. I'm not seeing any scientists being questioned. And so what that leaves me with is a global hegemony where the inequalities between North and South just continue to be reflected. And any attempts at decolonization or whatever just seem to pale in significance. And I think this creates a very, very worrying context, because it really does serve to undermine and efforts towards greater equality and inclusiveness, and to reinforce difference. However, on the more hopeful side, I think there are very important examples, not only in our own research, but elsewhere, other research, which points to many diverse examples of the use of digital technology, for example, within countries, within communities, and particularly during COVID's first lockdown in 2020, finding ways of volunteers using the digital technology to express solidarity with communities and individuals who no longer had access to resources, food, or specific needs that they had, data, whatever else, and linking them with individuals who could donate, people located in poorer and wealthier communities. And the recipients of the funds were able to make their own choices about how they would spend those, the support received. That's just one very small example of how the solidarity can inform more equitable relationships and a commitment to transformation instead of these hierarchical relationships in which people are othered and vulnerable communities continue to be excluded. I'm sorry to be so pessimistic.
No, that's good. And we heard the birds chiming in there in solid agreement of that very, very wise point. Let me ask us each to end on this, because I think that I think the ability to change and learn must be a part of this, and we must be able to do that in a supportive space. So I'm going to ask us each this question. What did you learn today? What did you learn today that you will now bring back into your organization or into your research? And I'm also going to ask Heather and David to participate in that. Let me first say that I learned as executive director of IAVE that we simply need to double down our support for our global network of volunteer leaders, because that's where the inclusivity and our social contract around inclusivity has its greatest opportunity. I am also going to recommit to partnership with the organizations around this virtual table and beyond, because the days of the lone wolf are indeed over, and we simply cannot survive and thrive with ourselves at the helm. We simply must act in partnership. This conversation has really made me realize that. So, Helene, I'm going to turn to you quickly. What have you learned that is going to change perhaps your thinking or the way you conduct research? And again, I am going to ask us to be as brief as possible.
Thank you, Nicole. For me, what stands out, Alice's presentation, Jane's presentation on the UNV State of World Volunteering Report, and the work that we've done, is that leadership is absolutely critical to change. And that means participatory leadership. It is not a one-person show. And Nicole, I think our research bore out that when organizations work together, they have a much better chance of surviving and making change. So that's been reinforced for me today. And some of it comes from Alice's analysis, which is really helping us lead our understanding of how to look at things in a new way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helene. Jane, may I ask you that same question? What did you learn today that you're going to make sure you take back to your organization and into your research?
I think for me, what I've learned is about partnerships, but from a different level, not from the level of the research that was done by UNV, but basically partnerships with others who are working in the same space on issues of volunteerism. learning from them, academia, other organizations. I think that is a major takeaway in terms of the insights that you get from others looking at the issues with different approaches. So I think for me, that is a takeaway. And yeah, that's for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Alice?
Well, I've learned today from re-looking at the presentations and seeing the different reports that have come in is actually maybe how we need to rethink how research is done in this space and maybe the role for volunteers within that. We're talking about inclusion, we're talking about kind of thinking more broadly about who volunteers are. Well, how are we also involving those same people in the research process and in also producing the outputs? So that's that's definitely something that I've learned today. Thank you.
Very good, and an excellent way to bring into practice those values around inclusivity that we all talk about. David, may I ask you to come on and talk about VGA and what you've learned that you're going to make sure you take forward into the Volunteer Groups Alliance work?
Certainly, and I really appreciated some of the consistency in the data and how strong the evidence is on the power of volunteering, particularly in the past 2 years. And my key takeaway is how I want to utilize this information in the messaging that we do, particularly putting together position papers for the United Nations on the role of volunteering in sustainable development, and particularly using the analysis from Alice to help frame very clearly what policymakers and governance need to be doing to help increase the support and capitalize on the maximum contribution of engaging volunteers.
Thank you, David. James O'Brien, who is the Executive Director of Forum, may I turn to you to answer that question about what you have heard today that you're going to be sure to take forward and focus your work around. James?
Thanks, Nicole. I think I'd agree with what the other presenters have said in response to this question. I think the task for us, and my main takeaway from today, is there is a huge amount of commonality between the three really important pieces of research, and there's a huge amount of commonality between the experiences of all sorts of volunteer involving organizations over the last year or two. I think the work for us now is to take the insights from this research and to turn it into concrete, actionable strategies and ways of working that organizations can apply in the years to come. I think that's, for me, the main takeaway. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you, James. Well, let me just say in a brief summary, this has been such an amazing conversation. The robustness of the information and the wisdom, I keep using that word, that has come out today. I hope we will each take, and we will all take, and we will really understand how to use it to inform what we do. Someone said to me the other day, you can either continue to do what you've done, or you can do better. And I just think the situation that we're presented with and the enormous amount of challenges we're facing as a global society call us to do better than has been done before. And so I really do look forward to doing that. I look forward also to doing it in partnership and in collaboration with this group and with others. Let me just leave it to say thank you. Thank you first and foremost to our amazing panelists, presenters, for the partnership of VGA and for Forum, and for all of the work that has been done to produce this information that we will now all benefit from. Thank you so very much, not only for your time, but again, for the contributions to the sector that you have made. I would also like to thank all of the participants. You are the ones, after all, who do the hard work every single day across the volunteer sector. We know that, we realize that, and I thank you so much for your engagement today, but your participation throughout the year. I also want to thank Wendy Osborne, who we have not seen here today, but who was instrumental in producing IAVE's research, but also in pulling this incredibly informative panel together. And of course, to Jessica Hahn, who works often behind the scenes, but whose work is evident in the perfection and flawlessness that you see here today, or at least I hope you've seen here today. So thank you so much. I do want to just end by saying this conversation will indeed continue on March 10th through the next iteration of Let's Talk Volunteering, where we will be exploring trends from the research in Asia Pacific. And then again on April 28th, where we will look at this in terms of research in Europe. So I'm seeing all of the thank yous, all of the connections come through on the chat. And again, to close with one big thank you to all of you for all of the work. And I look forward to speaking and connecting sometime again in 2022. Thank you so much.